He saw a slight Asian woman in jeans and a faded college sweatshirt browsing the food court at Crabtree Valley Mall in Raleigh, someone who looked tired, unremarkable, easy to overlook. He didn't see the surgical precision in how she moved through crowds, maintaining sightlines, never letting anyone approach her 6 o'clock. He didn't see the legend, Army Ranger Captain Sarah Chen, the ghost who pulled 12 operators out of the Hindu Kush under sustained fire, the woman the Pentagon erased because her mission never officially happened. Sarah carried a folded flag in her jacket pocket, fingers brushing the fabric every few minutes like a rosary. The flag came from Martinez, her fire team leader, the one who didn't make it out. She touched it the way soldiers touch saints' medals. Her left leg bore shrapnel scars that pulled tight when she walked too far, a barely perceptible limp that made her shift her weight to the right with each step. The mall smelled like cinnamon and grease, sounds echoing off high ceilings, teenagers laughing near the arcade, a toddler crying somewhere near the fountain, the ambient hum of 1,000 lives intersecting for 90 minutes and then scattering. Sarah ordered coffee, black, at a kiosk near the food court and sat alone at a table positioned with its back against the wall. Always near an exit. Always where she could see the doors. Always the same way. 3 years of night shift at Cedar Creek Medical had done nothing to break her of it, and nothing ever would. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a sound most people didn't notice because they'd learned to filter it out. Sarah heard everything. She always had. Her job in the psychiatric unit meant watching people, reading the micro-expressions that came before violence, understanding what bodies said when voices lied. She was good at her job. Nobody at Cedar Creek knew that good. 2 floors above the food court, in the administrative offices, Dr. Marcus Mercer was having a conversation that would collapse his entire career in exactly 42 days. He didn't know that yet. He smiled at Gerald Pierce, the mall manager, the way men smiled when they were about to commit a crime that felt perfectly legal. Pierce's brother-in-law worked in pharmaceutical administration. Mercer worked in oncology. The arrangement was simple. Inflate the dosage recommendations on 3 chemotherapy protocols. Pierce gets a percentage of the inflated billing. Mercer gets a percentage of Pierce's percentage. The patients get the same treatment. Nobody loses. Except the patients, but the patients were already losing anyway, weren't they? Terminal cases. Nobody counts the money too carefully when death is already in the room. Your sister know you're involved in this? Mercer asked, loosening his tie. Does your wife know you're involved in this? Pierce shot back. Both men smiled. Both men were idiots. Both men were about to meet a woman who would not smile back. Sarah's coffee was still hot. She'd made it to 3:51 p.m. on a Saturday off, which meant she had 4 hours and 13 minutes before she'd have to think about the night shift starting Sunday at 11 p.m. She tried not to think about Cedar Creek at all on Saturdays. She tried to think about nothing. The trying never worked. Her hand kept moving through medical procedures even when they were holding coffee cups. Her eyes kept scanning rooms for exits and threats even when she was looking at mall directories. The body remembers what the mind tries to forget, and Sarah's body remembered extracting a blown-out femoral artery in a convoy truck that smelled like diesel and copper and fear. The body remembered the sound of 7.62 rounds punching through metal plating. The body remembered keeping 3 operators alive for 12 hours while waiting for the Black Hawk that finally came at dawn. But that was then. Now she was just a nurse in a college sweatshirt drinking black coffee at a mall. Except the man was collapsing. He was maybe 70, wearing a Vietnam veteran's baseball cap and a windbreaker that hung loose on his frame, the kind of loose that meant he'd dropped 30 pounds in 6 months and nobody knew why. His name was Brigadier General Howard Stevens, though Sarah wouldn't know that for another 5 minutes. Right now, she just knew a man was falling. His lips were already blue. His hand reached out as if gravity might reverse itself if he asked nicely. His mouth opened but no sound came. That was the tell, that was the thing that made her stand up while everyone else stood still. A man with his mouth open and no air coming out meant his lungs were already drowning in their own cavity. Tension pneumothorax. Air pocket pressing on the heart, collapsing the lung, killing him in real time while teenagers kept laughing and a mother kept pushing a stroller and Sarah moved because her hands had already decided. She was on her knees beside him before her mind caught up with her body. "I need a pen. Now." Her voice didn't sound like it was asking. It sounded like it was commanding. A woman nearby fumbled in her purse and produced a ballpoint. Sarah didn't say thank you. There was no time for thank you. She found the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, felt for the landmarks with fingers that had done this in a convoy truck with metal screaming overhead, and she twisted the ballpoint barrel to create a hollow tube. The needle went in at an angle. There was resistance. Then there was a hiss, that sound, that exact sound of pressurized air escaping, and the general's color began to change. Blue to pink. Blue to pink. His chest rose. His lips stopped looking like stone. "Stay with me," she said, and her voice had dropped an octave. "Don't fight it. Just breathe. In through your nose. Out through your mouth. You're already home." The man breathed. He cried. He lived. The mall had gone silent. The way public spaces go silent when something real happens in the middle of something ordinary. A toddler stopped crying. Teenagers stopped laughing. Shoes stopped squeaking on polished floor. Sarah kept her hand steady on the ballpoint casing, kept her other hand on the man's shoulder, kept talking in a voice that had nothing to do with the coffee order she'd placed 4 minutes ago. Time had fractured. The before Sarah and the after Sarah didn't look alike. The paramedics arrived in 90 seconds. The first one out of the ambulance was a man in his early 50s with a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, the kind of scar that had a story attached. He saw Sarah's hands on the needle decompression. He saw the angle. He saw the ballpoint casing. His eyes went very still. "That's a Hindu Kush technique," he said quietly. "Not a question. A recognition. I only saw it once. 12 operators. Sustained fire. A ranger captain pulled us all out." He was looking at her hands, not her face. Her hands had calluses in the wrong places. Her hands had scars that told stories no civilian nurse should have. "That was you, wasn't it?" Sarah didn't answer. She was already stepping back, already handing off the patient, already disappearing the way ghosts disappear. But it was too late. The recognition had happened. The moment had been observed. The thing she'd buried for 3 years had just been dug up by a paramedic in Raleigh, North Carolina, in a shopping mall that smelled like cinnamon and grease and sudden, impossible truth. "We've got him," the paramedic said, and she heard the respect in his voice, the kind of respect that came from understanding exactly what you were standing next to. "Thank you, Captain." Nobody else heard it. But Sarah did. Captain. He'd called her Captain. And that single word had unraveled something that was supposed to stay buried forever. Gerald Pierce was walking down from the administrative offices when he heard the commotion. He made it to the food court perimeter just as the ambulance doors were closing, just as the paramedics were loading a blue-lipped elderly man into the truck. He scanned the crowd out of habit, the way managers scan crowds, and his face went pale. It was pale the way faces go pale when they see a ghost they'd been hoping was actually dead. Sarah Chen was standing there, wiping her hands on her jeans, and Gerald Pierce had seen her before, in hospital orientation. Volunteer first aid trainer. She'd done CPR instruction for the staff. She'd been polite. Quiet. Deferential to everyone. Now she was wearing a bloodless stare and standing over a man she'd just brought back from the edge of something darker than the mall's fluorescent lights could reach. Now she looked like someone who'd seen the worst thing the world had to offer and decided to keep going anyway. Now she looked like someone who could end your career with a phone call. Gerald Pierce pulled out his phone and called his brother-in-law, Dr. Marcus Mercer. "We have a problem," Pierce said. On the other end, in his comfortable corner office at Cedar Creek Medical, Mercer asked what the problem was. "The nurse you don't know about. She just saved someone at my mall." And I think she's about to start asking questions about things you don't want her to know. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Marcus Mercer began to smile, the way men smile when they realize they're trapped and the only way out is through. He said one word: suspend her? 3 weeks earlier at Cedar Creek Medical, the fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song as Sarah Chen stood before the Grand Rounds Assembly, her voice steady as she presented the case. 23 residents, 4 attending physicians, and Dr. Marcus Mercer sat arranged in the tiered conference room like a jury already decided on guilt. Sarah had prepared for this moment the way she'd prepared for every operation: meticulous, methodical, certain. Post-op day 3, 67-year-old male, routine sigmoid colostomy reversal, she began, her gaze moving from chart to faces. Vitals appeared stable until 0400 this morning. Temperature 37.8, heart rate elevated to 118, but BP held at 112/68. Most concerning, the patient reported abdominal pain he described as different from expected post-operative discomfort. Sharper. Localized to the left lower quadrant. I documented subtle tachypnea, increased respiratory rate of 22, which could indicate early compensation. Dr. Mercer leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking beneath his weight like a chair in an interrogation room, and raised one hand. The gesture was dismissive before he spoke a word. "Miss Chen," he said, his voice carrying the smooth arrogance of a man accustomed to never being questioned, "this is exactly the kind of catastrophizing that wastes precious resources and frightens patients unnecessarily. You see zebras where there are horses. Post-operative pain is expected. Elevated vitals are expected. The patient had major surgery 72 hours ago." He stood, and the room's attention shifted like a spotlight following his movement across the stage. He walked to her presentation board, pulled her charting from the stack with deliberate slowness, and held it up to the gathered residents like evidence at trial. "Note the excessive documentation," he continued, his tone moving into the register of a teacher instructing children on basic concepts. "When you're uncertain of your clinical judgment, Miss Chen, you hide behind paperwork. You create narratives. You make connections that don't exist." The visiting resident smirked. Sarah watched their faces shift, some genuinely amused, others performing amusement because that was what Mercer's authority demanded. One younger resident, a woman with dark hair pulled back tight, looked at Sarah with something that might have been sympathy before quickly looking away. The room's temperature seemed to drop. Sarah took one measured breath, the kind she'd learned in the Hindu Kush when the radio operator beside her had been hit and there were 6 minutes before extraction, and she met Mercer's eyes. A single tear escaped, not from sadness, but from the sheer pressure of holding composure while being systematically dismantled in front of your peers. She wiped it away with the back of her hand before anyone else could register it fully. "The patient is currently in the ICU on pressors, doctor," she said quietly. "Septic shock confirmed 2 hours ago. Blood cultures grew gram-negative organisms. He's responding to aggressive fluid resuscitation and antibiotics." Mercer's face reddened, not from shame, but from the irritation of being contradicted. His mouth tightened. He laughed, a sound like ice cracking, and turned back to the room. "Lucky guess, Nightingale," he said, the nickname dripping with contempt like battery acid. "Very lucky indeed." He returned to his seat and continued the rounds as if Sarah were invisible, moving to the next presenter, the next chart, the next opportunity to demonstrate his superiority. The residents didn't look at her again. The silence in her direction was complete. That night, at 0300 hours, Sarah stood at the vending machine on the 3rd floor break room, her hand reaching for black coffee because she'd learned long ago that anything sweet felt like a betrayal when your body had been trained to run on adrenaline and discipline. The machine hummed its electronic song, indifferent to her presence. Mercer walked in, unusual for him, unusual for anyone at this hour, and she felt his presence before she actually turned. His presence had a quality to it, like the air pressure changing before a storm, except this storm wore a white coat and a Rolex. "Still here, Nightingale," he said, moving to the refrigerator with the casual ownership of someone who'd never questioned his right to occupy any space. "Thought you'd have flown away by now." "Oh, wait." He smiled, and the smile was a wolf showing its teeth. "You can't actually fly, can you? Just fetch bedpans and take orders." Sarah retrieved her coffee. The cup was hot in her hands, steam rising in thin white columns. She didn't turn to face him, didn't give him the satisfaction of defensive energy. "Someone has to be here when patients need real care," she said, her voice level as a surgical laser. It wasn't a response designed to wound. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse. Mercer's jaw tightened. She heard it in the quality of his breathing, saw it reflected in the break room's fluorescent-lit mirror. He left without another word. By 03:15, Sarah was back on the floor, back in the rooms with the dying and the recovering, back where she was meant to be. But that wasn't the worst part. That had come 2 nights earlier, at 0200 hours on a Thursday, when Sarah had driven to Cedar Creek Medical to pick up an identification badge she'd left at her locker. She'd planned to retrieve it quietly, spend 15 minutes maximum, and leave. The parking garage had been nearly empty, just the night shift staff and a few security vehicles. She'd taken the elevator to level 2, the medical staff parking level, and had been walking toward the far end when she heard voices. 2 men. One was unmistakably Dr. Mercer. The other wore the polo shirt of a pharmaceutical representative. She recognized the logo on his chest, Syntex Pharmaceuticals, the same company whose injectable chemotherapy agents Mercer had recently begun prescribing at nearly triple the national average dose. They stood between a pearl-white Mercedes and a concrete pillar, the kind of location chosen specifically because security cameras couldn't see it, that gap in coverage every hospital had if you knew where to look. Sarah had been trained to move unseen. She used those skills now, stepping behind an SUV, her breathing controlled and silent as prayer. The pharmaceutical rep was handing Mercer an envelope. Not small. Thick enough that the man's hand visibly lowered under its weight. Cash. Same arrangement as last month, the rep was saying, his voice the oily smoothness of a man accustomed to corruption. $2,000 for each patient you enroll in the Syntex protocol. The higher dose regimen generates our best margins. Nobody questions it because you're the attending. You write the orders. Insurance pays. We both win. Mercer opened the envelope slightly, counted with his thumb, and smiled. It was the same smile he'd given Sarah in the break room, the same wolf-showing teeth expression. "I'll have at least 8 more enrollments by month's end," he said. "These cancer patients, they're too sick to advocate for themselves. Families too desperate to question dosing." Perfect. He folded the envelope and slipped it into his jacket pocket with movements that suggested this was routine, choreographed, practiced. They parted without handshakes, too professional for that, too cautious. By the time Sarah was certain the conversation had ended, her hands were trembling. Not from fear. From the specific kind of rage that comes from understanding that somewhere in this hospital, patients were being systematically over-medicated for profit while their families held vigil and prayed. She'd made it back to the locker room on autopilot, retrieved her badge, and driven home in silence. Yesterday, Mercer had been reviewing Sarah's medication counts at the nurse's station, his voice pitched loud enough for everyone to hear. "Your charting times are suspicious," he'd said, turning pages in the medication log with deliberate slowness. "Medication signed out at intervals that suggest you're not actually at bedside. This pattern suggests you're preparing doses in advance or possibly not accounting for them properly. I'm watching you, Miss Chen." The other nurses had suddenly become very busy with their own charting. No one made eye contact. No one offered a word of support or even acknowledgement. That was the power of Mercer's contempt. It was contagious, a social infection that spread through institutional silence. Sarah had absorbed it the way she absorbed everything. One measured breath. No response. No reaction. Just the quiet understanding that Mercer knew she'd seen him. Knew she could destroy him with a single report to hospital administration, with a call to the state pharmacy board. He was building his case now, creating documentation, laying groundwork, fabricating discrepancies that would discredit her as a witness. He was competent in his destruction the way he was competent in his crime, systematic, premeditated, careful. And Sarah, standing there with her silence wrapped around her like armor, understood that she was now operating within a different kind of battle. One where the weapons were paperwork and whispered insinuation and the institutional machinery of a hospital that would protect one of its own. Her phone buzzed at 18:47 hours. A text from the scheduling system: your Saturday shift 0700 to 1900 has been cancelled per staff reduction. Will contact regarding rescheduling. Saturday off. First one in 6 weeks. Sarah read the message twice, understanding the subtext. Mercer was limiting her access. Limiting her presence. Isolating her. She dressed in civilian clothes, jeans, a light jacket, the folded flag from her fallen teammate Martinez still in the pocket, a weight she'd carried for 3 years, and drove toward the Crabtree Valley Mall. She needed somewhere public. Somewhere loud enough that she couldn't hear her own thoughts, where the noise could drown out the recognition that her past and her present were about to collide in ways she couldn't control. The mall at 1430 hours on a Saturday was a moving river of families and teenagers and couples, all of them occupied with the simple luxury of having nowhere urgent to be. Sarah walked past the pretzel stand, past the fountain where coins glinted beneath chlorinated water like secrets buried in blue. That's when she heard it, not a scream, but something worse, the collective gasp of people who understood in their bodies that something had shifted toward catastrophe. An elderly man, silver-haired, wearing a Vietnam veteran's ball cap with the insignia of the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marine stitched in gold thread, had collapsed near the Orange Julius. His lips were the color of old denim, deepening toward purple. His neck veins were distended like cords pulled tight. Sarah could see it from 20 feet away, the trachea shifted rightward, the chest cavity no longer functioning as a container but as a pressure chamber. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped. Lung collapsed. Heart being pushed aside like a fist closing around it. Shoppers formed a useless circle, phones already appearing, someone calling 911, a teenage employee in an Orange Julius polo asking if anyone knew CPR with the desperate hope of someone who'd never actually wanted to perform it. Sarah dropped to her knees, and as she did, her jacket fell open just enough that the folded flag was visible in her pocket, a small rectangle of old military cotton, treated with the kind of care people reserved for sacred objects. "I'm a nurse," she said, her voice shifting into a register it didn't use in hospital corridors. This voice was command. This voice was authority born from surviving situations where authority was the difference between living and dying. Everyone stepped back. Now. She borrowed a pen from a young woman in the crowd, and her hands moved with a precision that no hospital night shift nurse possessed. She disassembled the pen with movements too fast and too confident, her fingers finding the ballpoint casing, the internal tube, reducing it to a needle. She located the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, the anatomical landmark she'd marked on training cadavers a lifetime ago. She talked the man through it, her voice steady as a surgeon's. "Stay with me, sir. You're going to feel pressure. Sharp. It's necessary. Breathe when I tell you. Breathe now." She performed the needle decompression with the pen casing, and the rush of escaping air was audible, so hiss like a pressure valve releasing, like a held breath finally exhaled. The man's color began returning almost immediately, the desperate blue fading toward something closer to human. A paramedic arrived, Morrison, his name tag read, and Sarah recognized the bearing, the competence, the way his eyes moved through the scene with the precision of someone trained in the worst scenarios. He stared at her hands. At the angle of the needle. At the way she was monitoring post-procedure status, watching the patient's breath sounds, checking peripheral perfusion. His face went pale in a way that had nothing to do with medical emergency. "I know that technique," he whispered, his voice carrying the weight of memory. "Only saw it once. Hindu Kush, 2019. A ranger captain who saved my entire convoy under fire. You were," he stopped himself. Looked at her face. "You were in that extraction. You were." Sarah's face went cold. Not frightened. Cold. The kind of cold that comes when compartments you've kept sealed suddenly begin to fail. She stood without responding, without confirming, without denying. She tried to leave. Security appeared, mall protocol for medical incidents, and asked her to stay for a statement. While she was waiting, the mall manager arrived. Gerald Pierce. She recognized him immediately because his brother-in-law was Dr. Mercer. Because she'd seen them together at hospital auxiliary functions, their body language suggesting the kind of familial loyalty that transcended rational judgment. Pierce looked at her, and she watched the recognition move across his face like a shadow. She was on the hospital volunteer list. For first aid training. The same woman who'd been publicly humiliated by Mercer. The same woman who might have witnessed something in a parking garage. By the time Sarah gave her statement to police, she understood what was about to happen. The recognition was already spreading. The past had found her. And somewhere in his office at Cedar Creek Medical, Dr. Mercer was receiving a phone call from his brother-in-law, learning that the nurse he'd been systematically destroying had just identified herself to the entire hospital community, not as a victim, but as someone capable of emergency medicine that shouldn't have been possible for someone at her supposed experience level. Within 48 hours, the formal complaint landed on Cedar Creek Medical's administrative desk like a cluster munition, each page carefully constructed to appear reasonable, bureaucratic, almost sympathetic. Dr. Marcus Mercer had learned long ago that the most effective weapon wasn't rage, it was procedure. A memo from HR Director Janet Walsh arrived in Sarah's inbox Monday morning at 6:27 a.m., disciplinary meeting, conference room C, 8:24 a.m. Attendance mandatory. No greeting. No context. Just the weight of institutional machinery grinding to life. Sarah sat in her car in the Cedar Creek parking lot, reading the email on her phone, watching nurses in blue scrubs hurry toward the employee entrance. The morning was grey. October rain had left everything damp, and the air smelled of wet asphalt and diesel from the delivery trucks backing up to the loading dock. She knew what this was. The parallel attack. Mercer couldn't touch her directly, not yet, but he could suffocate her through layers of policy and paper trails that made everything look legitimate. She'd seen this before. In Pakistan. In Syria. In the Hindu Kush, when command wanted someone neutralized without fingerprints. She was early. She walked the hospital corridors at 7:35 a.m., her badge still clipped to her scrub pocket, and the hallway felt different. Quieter. Nurses she'd worked with for 3 years nodded at her but didn't meet her eyes. Word had traveled. In hospitals, word always travels. A nurse getting called upstairs meant only one thing: investigation. Termination pending. Contagion. Conference room C smelled like old coffee and the chemical sweetness of industrial air freshener. The table was walnut and heavy, the kind designed to make people feel small. Janet Walsh was already there, mid-50s, wearing the expression of someone who'd learned to hide compassion behind a clipboard. Richard Cross, the hospital attorney, sat beside her, 60s, tailored grey suit, the kind of calm that comes from being paid to make problems disappear. And at the head of the table, Dr. Marcus Mercer. He was smiling. Not the smile from grand rounds. This one was different. This was the smile of a man holding a knife he'd been sharpening for weeks. "Sarah," he said, gesturing to an empty chair. "Thank you for coming on short notice." She sat a day. Her hands lay flat on the table. She didn't cross her arms. Defensive postures gave him ammunition. Captain Chen, not the night shift nurse Sarah, but the version of herself that had sat through interrogation briefings and hostile debriefings, took the wheel. Richard Cross opened a folder. Inside were documents. Sarah recognized her own signature on timesheets. "We've been conducting a routine review," he said, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, powerful, professional, utterly mechanical, following the incident at Crabtree Valley Mall on Saturday. He slid the first page across the table. "This is a summary of reported violations spanning the past 8 months." Sarah looked down. The list was meticulous. Fraudulent. Every entry was a lie constructed with the precision of someone who understood that hospitals ran on documentation. Unauthorized absence from assigned floor, September 14th. She'd been on the floor, she'd been in the medication room, checking inventory. Medication count discrepancy, August 22nd. She'd witnessed Mercer's pharmaceutical rep in the parking garage on the 23rd, late arrival, July 9th. She'd clocked in at 6:58 p.m. The shift started at 7:13 p.m. These don't match my records, Sarah said. Her voice was steady, almost conversational. This was the voice she used during emergency medicine, the one that didn't invite argument or negotiation. I have personal documentation for each date. Mercer leaned forward slightly. Sarah, we're not here to argue about timestamps. We're here to discuss a pattern of behavior. He gestured to the next document. The real issue is Saturday. You performed an invasive medical procedure on a civilian in a public space. You had no authorization, no documentation, no supervision. You used a ballpoint pen as a makeshift medical instrument. The patient was in cardiac distress, Sarah said. Tension pneumothorax. Cyanosis. Without needle decompression, he would have arrested within 5 minutes. You're a floor nurse, Richard Cross said. His tone wasn't angry. That was worse. Anger could be fought. His tone was the careful gentleness of a prosecutor who'd already won. Not a trauma physician. Not an emergency specialist. You have no certification in emergency medicine beyond basic BLS. Performing advanced interventions in non-hospital settings creates significant liability exposure for this facility. It suggests poor judgment. Impulsivity. It saved a life, Sarah said. Perhaps, Cross continued, but at what cost to institutional liability? What if your procedure had failed? What if the patient had sued Cedar Creek Medical for associating with staff members who perform unauthorized medical interventions? What if? Mercer interrupted, his voice dropping into something almost gentle. Almost paternal. Sarah, I think you're a dedicated nurse. I do. But you have to understand, this behavior pattern suggests you've lost sight of your limitations. The fabricated reports, the medication discrepancies, the unauthorized intervention at the mall. It creates a picture. Of what? Sarah asked. Of someone who thinks she's above protocol. He opened another folder. Inside were photographs. Sarah's hands went still. The images showed her standing over the collapsed veteran at Crabtree Valley Mall. Someone had captured her performing the needle decompression, the angle of her hands, the precision of her technique, the way her entire body moved with a kind of choreographed authority that didn't match a floor nurse's training. In one photo, her expression was absolutely blank. In another, her hands were moving faster than a camera should have been able to capture clearly, and there was something in her posture that looked less like a nurse improvising and more like someone who'd done this before. Many times. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum in their ceiling fixtures. Where did you get these? Sarah asked. Mall security footage, Janet Walsh said quietly. Forwarded to us by mall management. They were concerned about liability. She didn't add, by our brother-in-law, Gerald Pierce, who called me at home and said his sister's family is very interested in keeping this situation contained. Sarah's jaw tightened. Not from fear. From calculation. Gerald Pierce worked mall security. She'd seen him twice at hospital auxiliary volunteer events, both times he'd stood near Mercer during coffee breaks. The connection had been there. She'd simply underestimated the speed with which Mercer would move. You're being suspended, effective immediately, Richard Cross said. He slid a document across the table. Pending investigation into violations of hospital protocol, inappropriate scope of practice, and behavioral conduct. Your badge will be confiscated. You're restricted from hospital premises except to meet with our investigator. Any attempts to contact hospital staff or patients may result in immediate termination and referral to the state medical board. I'm a nurse, Not a physician, Sarah said. The board has no jurisdiction. They have jurisdiction over anyone practicing medicine without a license, Cross said. And what you did on Saturday looked remarkably like practicing medicine. The question isn't whether you had a license. It's whether you had training we don't know about. Mercer stood up. You can go home, Sarah. HR will contact you about timeline for the investigation. You're being very generous. Most facilities would have terminated you immediately. We think you deserve the courtesy of a process. Sarah stood. Her movements were smooth. Controlled. The kind of control that comes from having been trained to move in rooms where one wrong gesture could escalate a situation into violence. She looked at each of them in sequence. Janet Walsh looked away first. Richard Cross maintained eye contact. He was professional enough not to flinch. Mercer smiled. You have no idea who you're standing next to, Sarah said. Her voice was different now. Quieter. The kind of quiet that made the air pressure change. But you're about to find out. Is that a threat? Cross asked, his hand moving toward his phone. It's an observation, Sarah said. 2 hours later, she stood in the employee locker room with a cardboard box that had once held printer paper. Her name badge clipped to her scrub pocket. Her stethoscope. A coffee mug someone had given her 3 years ago that said Nurse Life with cartoon hearts. 7 shifts worth of personal items reduced to objects someone could hold in their arms. The folded flag from Martinez sat in the bottom of her locker, her teammate, the 23-year-old from San Antonio who'd bled out in her arms during the extraction in the Hindu Kush. She took it out carefully. Placed it in the box, beneath everything else. A security officer appeared in the doorway. Mid-30s, name tag that read Morrison. He looked uncomfortable. I have to walk you out, he said. Hospital policy. Sarah nodded. She picked up the box. They walked through the back corridors, not the main hallway where other staff would see, and emerged into the parking lot where the rain had started again, steady and cold. Morrison held the door open for her. For what it's worth, he said quietly, nobody in security believes those medication count discrepancies. Mercer's been using his badge to access the pharmacy after hours for 3 months. We've documented it. We just don't know what to do with the information. Sarah paused. Document everything, she said. Times, dates, footage. Give it to someone you trust outside the hospital. You planning something? Morrison asked. I'm planning to disappear, Sarah said. But not the way Mercer thinks. From his office window on the 3rd floor, Dr. Marcus Mercer watched her cross the parking lot, cardboard box in her arms, security officer beside her. He watched her load the box into the trunk of her car. He watched her sit in the driver's seat for exactly 2 minutes, not moving, not starting the engine. And then he saw something that made him pause. She reached into her pocket and pulled out something small, he couldn't see what from this distance, and held it against her chest. For the first time in 48 hours, Dr. Mercer felt something that wasn't satisfaction. It was a flicker. Just a moment. An instinct born from 15 years of reading human behavior, and it whispered a single word, miscalculation. He turned away from the window. Sarah sat alone in the Cedar Creek parking lot with the rain hammering her windshield like applause, and somewhere in her pocket, a folded flag felt impossibly heavy, the weight not of cloth, but of secrets. Mercer had just made his first critical error. He'd assumed she was trying to hide her identity. He'd missed the essential truth, she was trying to protect everyone around her. The Waffle House sat 6 miles from Cedar Creek Medical, fluorescent tubes casting a sickly yellow glow across the empty dining room at 3 in the morning. Sarah Chen occupied a booth in the corner, back to the wall, a habit that would never leave her bones. The coffee in front of her had gone cold an hour ago. She'd ordered it and never touched it, just stared at her own reflection in the dark window, a woman she barely recognized anymore, someone caught between 2 lives that were both disappearing. The folded flag lay on the table between the salt and pepper shakers. It was Marine Corps colors, tri-folded with military precision, the creases sharp enough to draw blood. Sarah's fingers moved toward it, then stopped. She couldn't touch it tonight. If she touched it, the weight would crush her. Martinez had been 23 years old when he took the round meant for her in the Hindu Kush, 300 meters north of the extraction point, rain like shrapnel falling from a sky the color of iron. She'd carried his body 3 kilometers on her shoulders while his blood ran down her back and mixed with her own. She'd sung to him the whole way, a low, wordless hum that kept her moving, kept her from thinking about how his arm kept sliding off her neck because there was no muscle left to grip with. The waitress, a woman with tired eyes and a name tag that said Diane, refilled Sarah's coffee without asking. "Honey, you need to eat something," she said. Her voice sounded like she'd swallowed gravel and regret. "I'm fine," Sarah said. It was the kind of lie that people accepted without question, a military lie, the kind you told so often it became a reflex. Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from Morrison, the paramedic who'd arrived after the mall collapse. "The man you saved is asking for you. Name's Howard Stevens. Says he's a retired general. Hospital ran a background check to process the incident report for their records." The coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. Background checks accessed federal databases. Cedar Creek's system would have routed through standard medical clearance protocols, but if the name Sarah Chen was flagged, if her embedded security clearance, the one buried 3 layers deep in Pentagon classification, was still active despite everything they'd promised, the system would have generated an alert. A red flag on a dead file. A ghost waking up. She'd been told in a DOD briefing room at Fort Bragg that her service record would be sanitized. Operation Resolute Guardian classified above her clearance. Honorable discharge under administrative pretenses. A new social security number. New identity. New life. The words had felt like a coffin lid closing. "You will maintain a low profile indefinitely," the Pentagon liaison had said. "You are alive because we erased you. Stay erased." Sarah had nodded. 3 years of being erased. 3 years of night shifts and condescension from Dr. Marcus Mercer, a man who'd never sweated through his uniform in a combat zone, who'd never held a dying soldier while waiting for a helicopter that might never come. 3 years of watching him dismiss her during grand rounds, of taking his contempt like penance. She'd thought staying invisible was the cost of living. Now the cost was coming due. If a Pentagon security protocol had been triggered by her name appearing in Cedar Creek's background check database, if someone, anyone, started asking questions about Captain Sarah Chen, about Operation Resolute Guardian, about why a classified soldier had been working night shifts in a civilian hospital in Raleigh, North Carolina, then Mercer's suspension would look like a mercy. It would look like him trying to keep her safe. It would look like nothing. Sarah reached into her jacket pocket and felt the folded flag. The weight of it was impossible, a triangle of fabric and memory, 13 folds representing the 13 original states, though everyone forgot that. They only remember the dead. Martinez had been her best forward observer, the kind of soldier who could read terrain like other people read books, who could calculate wind direction by watching how grass moved. He'd had a daughter he'd never met, born 3 months after his unit deployed. He talked about her constantly, showed Sarah a picture of his ex-girlfriend holding the baby, said he was going to fight to be in her life when he got home. Sarah had attended his funeral in a dress uniform that didn't have her name on it. She'd sat in the back. Nobody had known she was there. The rain outside hammered against the Waffle House windows like it was trying to break through. Thunder rolled across Raleigh like incoming artillery, the kind of sound that made Sarah's body remember things her mind was trying to forget. She closed her eyes. In the Hindu Kush, the storms came down like God's hammer. She treated frostbite and shrapnel wounds and hypothermia in the rain, her hands steady because they had to be, because people were dying and the only thing between chaos and order was her ability to not shake. Her hands were still steady. But her life wasn't. Diane approached with a slice of pie nobody had ordered. "Pie helps," she said. "When the world gets too quiet." Sarah didn't argue. She ate the pie mechanically, tasting nothing. Through the window, she watched the storm. A semi-truck pulled into the Waffle House parking lot, and the driver came in, water streaming from his jacket, looking the way men looked when they'd been running from something for too long. He ordered coffee at the counter and didn't speak to anyone. Sarah understood that. Her phone buzzed again. A news alert from the Cedar Creek Medical Staff Portal. Hospital announces immediate investigation into nursing staff member. Dr. Marcus Mercer has filed formal complaints regarding protocol violations and medication discrepancies. The investigation had moved fast. Faster than it should have. Which meant Mercer wasn't waiting for her to mess up again. He was executing. He'd filed his complaint, documented his accusations, and now the hospital was moving to protect itself. By the time HR finished their review, Sarah's reputation would be shredded. Nobody would hire her. Background checks would flag her as a risk. She'd be unemployable in medicine in this state, maybe in any state. She'd disappear again. But this time, it would be real. This time, nobody would be waiting to call her back. Her cover had been compromised. Her invisible life was ending. And the worst part, the thing that made her want to scream into the dark window, was that Mercer probably didn't even know what he'd done. He didn't know that by attacking her, he was potentially triggering a cascade of classified alerts that would bring every federal agency's attention down on him like lightning. He thought he was protecting his kickback scheme. He had no idea what was already in motion. Sarah touched the flag in her pocket again, let the weight of it settle in her palm. Martinez would have laughed at the absurdity, 3 years of hiding, and in a single afternoon at a shopping mall, the whole apparatus of secrecy had started to collapse. One sick old man. One emergency needle decompression. One paramedic who recognized the technique that could only be taught by a specific unit under specific circumstances. One slip. She wondered if disappearing once for your country meant you stayed disappeared forever. If the Pentagon called her back now, asked her to be Captain Sarah Chen again, testified about what happened in the Hindu Kush, exposed the operation that had been buried for diplomatic reasons, she'd have to leave. Again. Start over. Again. Run until there was nowhere left to run. The trucker at the counter left cash and walked back out into the rain. Diane cleared his cup without a word. The Waffle House was empty except for Sarah and the exhausted waitress and the smell of coffee that had been brewed too long, bitter and wrong. Sarah left a $40 bill under her cold coffee cup, 3 times what she'd consumed, and stood. Her movements were economical, practiced. She pulled her jacket tight and pushed through the doors into the storm. The rain hammered against her face like it was trying to wake her up, trying to remind her that hiding had never really been living. She didn't know that at Cedar Creek Medical, 3 departments had begun scanning classified security alerts. She didn't know that General Howard Stevens was reviewing his discharge paperwork, his memory of that extraction in the Hindu Kush crystalline and sharp. She didn't know that Torres, the Navy veteran running IT, had been flagged by a Pentagon security protocol and was already looking at Dr. Mercer's emails from the parking garage. She didn't know that her erasure was about to be reversed. All she knew, standing in the rain at 3:08 a.m. outside a Waffle House 6 miles from the hospital that had fired her, was that the weight of the folded flag in her pocket had finally become unbearable. And the only thing heavier than that weight was the silence that comes before everything changes. The Cedar Creek Medical Disciplinary hearing was scheduled for Thursday at 10 a.m., and Sarah had spent the previous 72 hours expecting nothing, no phone call, no reversal, no cavalry. The folded flag from Martinez stayed in her jacket pocket. She wore her civilian clothes, not scrubs, because the hospital had made it clear that those didn't belong to her anymore. The conference room on the 3rd floor had a view of the parking lot where security had walked her out, her badge swinging from their grip like evidence at a crime scene. Karen Voss, the hospital administrator, sat at the head of a mahogany table with Richard Cross, the hospital's attorney, flanking her like sentries guarding a fortress. Dr. Mercer was there too, his jaw tight, his fingers drumming against the armrest of his leather chair, the confidence of a man who believed he'd already won. Sarah sat across from them with her hands flat on the table. She didn't fidget. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. The room smelled like furniture polish and the copper-tinged tension of people about to have their entire understanding of hierarchy collapse. The door opened at 10:07 a.m. Brigadier General Howard Stevens walked in wearing dress blues that looked like they'd been tailored from pure authority. Behind him came a woman in a Pentagon grey blazer, her credentials clipped to her jacket like a weapon. The general's boots made no sound on the carpet, that kind of deliberate silence that only comes from 30 years of walking into rooms where people held their breath. He looked at Sarah for half a second, nodded once, and then his attention shifted to Mercer with the precision of a sniper's scope locking onto a target. "Dr. Mercer," the general said, and his voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that made everyone else sound loud by comparison. "I'm Brigadier General Howard Stevens. I believe you know my name from your phone records, though you never returned my call." Mercer's face went pale. "General, Not yet." The general pulled a chair backward, the wood scraping across tile with a sound like a knife being drawn, and sat down without asking permission. "You fired Captain Chen 3 days ago based on a fabricated complaint regarding her emergency intervention at Crabtree Valley Mall. I was the patient she saved. I was in tension pneumothorax, my SpO2 dropping into the 60s. I would be dead without her. But that's not why we're here." Sarah watched Mercer's throat constrict. He reached for water that wasn't there. "Captain Sarah Chen," the general continued, opening a leather folder with documents stamped in red across every page, served 3 tours in the Hindu Kush with the 75th Ranger Regiment. Her official record was sealed by the Department of Defense following Operation Resolute Guardian, a classified extraction operation that lasted 12 hours under sustained enemy fire. During that operation, Captain Chen performed emergency field surgery on 3 critically wounded operators using field-expedient methods while simultaneously coordinating air support and providing suppressive fire. She held that position until all personnel were extracted. Her actions resulted in the survival of 23 people who would otherwise have been confirmed KIA. He looked at Mercer the way a man looks at something he's about to step on. "The Bronze Star." Stevens laid down a citation. "The Silver Star." Another document, this one typed on official Pentagon letterhead. 2 Purple Hearts, one for shrapnel from an IED, one for a gunshot wound to the left shoulder that she dressed herself while still in the field. The reason you didn't know this is because the Pentagon classified her entire service record to bury an international incident that would have destabilized coalition operations. She became invisible by necessity. And then you tried to fire her for being too competent. The door opened again. A man in his 50s with the bearing of someone who'd spent 20 years staring at screens instead of sleeping walked in carrying a laptop. Torres, the hospital's IT director, the one everyone saw pushing a cart of cables but never really looked at. He was Navy, Sarah remembered from a Veterans Day mixer 3 months ago. His eyes were the color of deep water and twice as calm. "Dr. Mercer," Torres said, setting the laptop on the mahogany table, 3 weeks ago you attempted to delete security footage from the parking garage covering the period between 1:45 and 2:36 a.m. on multiple dates over the past 6 months. I was running a routine network audit. I found the deletion request still in cache memory. The screen lit up. Blue light reflected off Mercer's face, and Sarah watched something break in him, not loudly, but the way a dam fractures before it fails. There was Mercer, pharmaceutical rep in charcoal suit beside him, exchange happening in real time. An envelope passing. A handshake. The dates and times stamped in the corner, 1:53 a.m., 2:03 a.m., 1:52 a.m. The kind of meeting that only happened when people believed no one was watching. "I saved every frame," Torres said, and his voice had the steady precision of someone trained in cryptography, in hidden systems, in finding what others tried to bury. Navy training. We don't delete anything. We just hide it better than the person trying to erase it thought possible. And then I cross-referenced the pharmacy records. Another screen. Chemotherapy billing codes for patients discharged weeks prior. Treatment dates listed for people who'd been dead for months. Pharmaceutical inventory logs showing discrepancies between reported waste and actual dispensation. Numbers that didn't add up until you looked at them from the angle Torres had calculated, $2.4 million in fraudulent billing across 43 months. All of it connected to Dr. Mercer. All of it documented. All of it federal. Karen Voss pressed her hand against her chest like she might be having a cardiac event. Marcus, what is this? Richard Cross's face had gone the color of institutional tile. Dr. Mercer, I'm advising you not to say anything further. But Mercer was already talking, and the words came out like he was vomiting them. This is ridiculous. I'm a department head. I'm on the credentialing committee. She's just he pointed at Sarah, and his hand was shaking. She's just a night shift nurse who got lucky at a mall. Who does she think she is, coming in here? General Stevens leaned forward. The movement was minimal. His voice stayed quiet. Captain Chen held 23 lives together in a firefight that lasted from 0300 to 1500 hours. She performed a thoracotomy with a Leatherman multi-tool while calling in coordinates for Apache gunship support. The only reason you're breathing right now is because people like her do the things you can't imagine in places you'll never go. And when she came back from that, when she became invisible to keep the world from destabilizing, she worked night shift in a hospital that paid her $47,000 a year to take abuse from you. The room went dead silent. Not the kind of silence that comes from shock. The kind that comes from the moment a man realizes he's standing on ground that's already given way beneath him and he's only now feeling the fall. The FBI investigators arrived at 10:34 a.m. Two of them, one with the face of someone who'd been building this case for 6 months and had been waiting to make the arrest. They entered without ceremony, and the healthcare fraud charges they read out loud sounded like an execution speech: wire fraud, healthcare fraud, conspiracy, money laundering. The kind of federal charges that meant prison time, not suspension. The kind that meant a medical license didn't just get revoked, it became a criminal liability. They escorted Mercer out by the same arm technique, the same firm grip, the same dehumanizing hand on the back that he'd had done to Sarah 72 hours earlier. He didn't resist. He just looked small, which was the thing that made Sarah realize he'd always been small. She'd just been taught to see authority as something larger than it was. She watched from the conference room window, her hand still flat on the table. General Stevens stood beside her, and neither of them spoke. The parking lot was already beginning to lighten. It was still morning. The world kept rotating. The nurses on the second floor were probably starting their charting. Someone's patient was probably getting labs drawn. Someone else was probably hearing bad news that would change the shape of their family forever. Sarah thought about Martinez. About the operators whose names she still wasn't allowed to speak. About the 23 people who were alive because muscle memory and training and the refusal to leave anyone behind had overridden every instinct to survive alone. Captain, General Stevens said, his voice still that impossible quiet, you're reinstated, effective immediately. They're also offering you the emergency department clinical lead position. The one Mercer was blocking. The one you should have had 2 years ago. Sarah nodded. She didn't smile. The smile would come later, in private, if it came at all. 6 weeks later, the Cedar Creek medical parking lot was cold enough that breath made small clouds. Dawn was still a theory at 5:53 a.m., the sky the color of old bruises. Sarah stood in her scrubs, white ones, clean ones, the kind that meant she'd worked through the night in the emergency department, which meant she'd held lives together while the city slept. 72 patients. 43 diagnoses. 1 cardiac arrest she'd reversed with her hands, and the kind of calm that only comes from having already survived the worst. She was leaving Cedar Creek Medical today. She'd accepted a position with the Veterans Crisis Network, a non-profit outreach program, starting Monday. Something that felt like it might finally be hers, like she might finally be allowed to be seen. General Stevens was waiting in the parking lot, dress uniform immaculate, and beside him was a display case. Inside were medals she never received: Bronze Star, Silver Star, Purple Heart again. Her name engraved on each one. The citations laminated and mounted beneath them. The history of the Hindu Kush translated into metal and ribbon and the official recognition that the Pentagon had erased. He rendered a salute, his hand moving with the precision of a man who'd spent 30 years converting respect into physical gesture. Sarah, in scrubs, returned it, the salute she never got when they buried Martinez at Arlington. The one she never got when the Pentagon told her to disappear, to become invisible, to let other people take credit for saving lives that she'd held together with her own hands. She finally let herself cry, pressing Martinez's folded flag against her heart, the one that had lived in her pocket for 3 years while she worked the night shift and took abuse and saved a stranger at a mall without knowing that stranger was someone with the authority to change everything back. Dr. Mercer, she heard later, was teaching CPR at Raleigh Community College for minimum wage while awaiting trial. The federal investigation had expanded. 2 other physicians were implicated. The pharmaceutical company settled for $8.7 million in fines. Cedar Creek Medical's credentialing committee was disbanded and restructured. Torres, the Navy veteran in IT, was promoted to Chief Information Security Officer. Morrison, the paramedic from the mall, had joined the Veterans Crisis Network and would be working alongside Sarah, teaching combat trauma techniques to civilian first responders. Sarah drove away from Cedar Creek Medical as the sun rose, and for the first time in 3 years, she didn't check her mirrors every 30 seconds. She didn't anticipate the next move from someone trying to destroy her. She didn't plan her disappearance route. She just drove, and the sky got lighter, and somewhere in the city, people were waking up in hospitals where nurses like her were holding them together, and it felt like maybe, finally, like she could breathe. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. Thanks for watching. If Sarah's story resonated with you, please subscribe, hit that like button, and drop a comment below telling us, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? We read every single comment, and your stories matter. Fair winds and following seas.